Hey friends, how are you? So, when we had left, Henry was trying to come up with money because he wanted a football. Then his friend or his neighbor, Scooter, came over, and Scooter had the exact same football that Henry wanted. And they went out and they started playing catch, but the ball kept hitting the trees, so they decided to throw it across the street. And just as Henry threw it, a car came speeding by, the ball went in the window, and the car kept going. And they waited for the car to come back, and it didn't come back. And Scooter had said, You gotta buy me a new football before next Saturday, or I'll tell my dad, and he'll tell your dad, and then you'll really get it. Now, Henry suspected Scooter was right. He probably would get it. Once, when he had accidentally broken another boy's roller skates, his dad had given him a talking to, and then made him spend his own allowance money to have it fixed. Okay, he said, I'll get you a new football. I don't know how, but I guess I'll manage. Henry turned and went slowly into the house. Ribsy followed him. Oh, Ribs, now see what you've done? And after I spent my football money for your license and collar and your dish, too. Ribsy hung his head. Now, Henry was just twice as far. Sorry, my cat was meowing. Now, Henry was just twice as far from owning a real cowhide football with nylon stitching and buckskin lacings as he had been half an hour ago. He was quiet the rest of the afternoon and all through dinner. He was thinking. How about another piece of gingerbread? His dad asked. No, thank you, Henry said absent-mindedly. May I be excused, please? Why, Henry, do you feel well? Mrs. Huggins was surprised. Henry usually ate 2 pieces of gingerbread and a third if she would let him. Oh, sure, I feel all right, said Henry, and went out to sit on the front steps. Ribsy lay on the step below and dozed with his head on Henry's foot. Oh, good old Ribsy, Ribsy dog, even if you did get me into trouble, said Henry. He listened to the whoosh, click, whoosh, click of the water sprinkler next door and wondered how he was going to earn $13.95 in 1 week. He thought and thought. He could collect old tin foil. No, that would take too long. The junkmen didn't want little wads of tin foil that came out of little packets of gum. They wanted big pieces that were too hard to find. Maybe he could collect old papers and magazines from the neighbors. No, he'd already collected all he could find for a school paper drive the week before. Besides, the junkmen paid only half a cent a pound. He could open a lemonade stand by the park. Oh, but lemonade stands were just kid stuff. Moms and dads were the only people who really spent any money for lemonade. He could mow lawns. He could charge 50 cents for mowing lawns. He'd get $1 for 2 lawns. But he'd have to mow 28 lawns to earn $13.95. Even if he could get 28 lawns to mow, he didn't see how he could find the time after school. As the evening grew darker, Henry still sat on the steps, thinking and listening to the whoosh, click, whoosh, click, whoosh, click of the water sprinkler. Whoosh, click, whoosh, click. Then Mr. Hector Grumby, who lived next door, came out of the house and shut off the water. Henry liked Mr. Grumby, but he wasn't so sure about Mrs. Grumby. She sprinkled Doggy Begone on her bushes, and Ribsy didn't like that smell very much. Henry noticed that Mr. Grumby had a flashlight in one hand and a quart fruit jar in the other. Mr. Grumpy set the jar on the sidewalk, tiptoed onto the lawn, flashed his light on the grass, bent over, and pounced on something. He picked it up and put it in the jar, but it was too dark for Henry to see what it was. The next time Mr. Grumpy pounced, he didn't put anything into the jar, and Henry could hear him mutter, "Whoops, that one got away." Henry couldn't stand it any longer. He had to know what Mr. Grumpy was doing. He walked across his own lawn and peered over the rose bushes. "If you come any closer," said Mr. Grumpy, "you'd better tiptoe. I don't want to scare him away." "Scare what away?" asked Henry. "Night crawlers," said Mr. Grumpy. "Night crawlers!" exclaimed Henry. "What are night crawlers?" "Worms," said Mr. Grumpy. "Great big worms. Do you mean to say you lived here all these years and never seen a night crawler?" "No, I haven't," answered Henry. "How big are they?" "Oh, about 7 to 10 inches long." Golly! Henry could hardly believe it. 10 inches long? I didn't know worms came that big. "Here's one." Mr. Grumpy swooped and held up a worm in the beam of his flashlight. It was a big, fat worm, at least 9 inches long and as thick as a pencil. "Wow," said Henry. It was hard to believe, but there it was. Mr. Grumpy put it into the jar. "You use those worms to catch fish?" asked Henry. "That's right." Mr. Grumpy pounced again. "What kinds of fish?" "Well, some kinds of trout, salmon, perch, catfish, different kinds of fish. I'm going fishing for salmon in the Columbia River in the morning." Henry thought this over. "Do you always catch worms at night?" "Yeah, they only come out at night when the ground is wet. So I give the lawn a good soaking with my sprinkler so they'll come up to the top. Then I flash the light on them and grab them quick before they have a chance to pull back into the ground." Mr. Grumpy stepped out on the porch and called, Mrs. Grumpy stepped out on the porch and called to her husband, "Hector, if you expect me to have a lunch ready for you to take fishing at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd better go to the store and get a loaf of bread right now before it closes." All right, in a minute." As his wife went back into the house, Mr. Grumpy said to Henry, "Hey, Henry, how would you like to earn some money?" "Catching worms? Oh, I'll say I would." "I'll pay you a penny apiece for every night-crawling worm you catch." "Golly," said Henry, "a penny apiece? How many do you want?" "Oh, I'd take as many as you can catch, 'cause if I can't use them, some of the other guys can." He handed Henry the jar and the flashlight and got into his car and drove away to the store. A penny apiece. There were 100 pennies in a dollar, so it would take 1,395 worms to pay for the football, and 41 worms for the tax. Henry went around the rose bushes and tiptoed across the grass. Because of the doggy-be-gone, Ribsy stayed on his own side of the bushes. Henry turned on the flashlight, and sure enough, there on the grass was the end of a big fat worm. But when Henry went to pick it up, it was gone. So he tiptoed further across the grass and turned on the light again. This time, he moved faster. He grabbed the end of the cold, slippery worm. The other end was already in the ground. Henry pulled. The worm pulled. The worm stretched. It grew longer and thinner until it snapped out of Henry's hand and disappeared into the ground. "Ugh," said Henry. But the next time, he moved faster still. He pounced on the worm before either end had a chance to get in the ground. He caught it! That's 1 cent, 1 penny, he thought. After that, it was easier. He caught most of the worms on the first pounce. Pretty soon, he had caught 62 worms. Then, he discovered he was running out of worms. Either he had caught all of Mr. Grumpy's worms, or they had felt him walking around on the ground and had gone down deeper into the ground for the night, and he hadn't earned near enough to pay for the football. Just as Henry was wondering where he could find more worms, Mr. Grumpy came back from the store. Hey, Mr. Grumpy, I caught 62 worms for you, said Henry. 62? That's great! Mr. Grumpy reached into his pants pocket and brought out a handful of change. He picked out a 50-cent piece, a dime, and 2 pennies and gave them to Henry. Well, thank you, sir, said Henry politely. He sure wished he had caught more worms. Mr. Grumpy started to go into the house with his loaf of bread and then stopped. Say, Shorty, he said to Henry, who was going back through the rose bushes. I'll tell you what you can do. Sunday morning, I'm going to go fishing with a bunch of men from my lodge. Quite a few of us are going, and we can use all the worms you can catch. Tomorrow night, you get someone to help you and catch enough for all of us. Sure, said Henry eagerly. I'll catch hundreds of worms for you. Sure. Swell, 'cause we could really use them, answered Mr. Grumpy as he went into the house. Henry sat down on his front steps again. Because he needed so much money, he knew he'd have to catch all the worms himself. That means he'd need a lot of wet lawn. His mom would be pleased, even surprised, to have him water their lawn, but his lawn and the Grumpy's lawn still wouldn't be enough. Maybe he could ask all the people on the street to water their yards Saturday night. However, if he did that, Beezus and Robert and the other kids would ask what he was doing. Henry was afraid they'd want to earn money catching worms too. He knew Beezus would want to. She was the kind of girl who liked catching worms. Henry sat on the steps, wishing he had acres and acres of wet lawn. He thought and thought and thought about millions of wet green blades of grass with big fat worms peeping out from under him. The park! Of course, that was it! It was just a few blocks away, and because September had been unusually warm this year, they watered the grass in the park every day. If his mom would let him stay up later than 9 o'clock, he knew he could catch enough worms to pay for the football. And that's where we're going to stop. I think this is the extent of how long my videos can go. So I'll save it and post it, and hopefully you will listen and enjoy. So I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon.